This recording is slightly premature because I'm in a little bit of a mess and I'm still sort of collating things and trying to see patterns, which is, yeah, always embarrassing. So let me just make a brief update and talk about what I do know in some sense, and what I'm unsure about. Uh, because I've been dislocated from thinking about Metagram for quite a while, and also because I never had to think about Metagram in a broad way when I was dealing with Metagram, because it was such a purely empirical. It was structured and built with some theory, with some backbone of some theory, after discovering certain patterns of sequential flows and things like that. And so after seeing those patterns, anyway, but I've never had to robustly understand it. I've only had to understand it on the atomic level. It's like, it to make a decent analogy, but it's still a bit anyway. It's like understanding each different case of subatomic property or something like that, but not collating all the functions that would allow you to get towards approximating phenomena in chemistry, which can be done, but it's a sophisticated bridge to get from subatomic, properties into uh, uh, phenomena phenomena on the level of chemistry, and so anyway, and that's kind of what I'm doing, which is very hard at the moment. I'm trying to find a bridge from metagram to metatype, but at the same time also knowing that it's fundamentally impossible without knowing a target to try to seek consilience, uh, a target to hit, in which how metagram and metatype are going to couple together, which I'm still sort of in the dark about, apart from finding some kind of, being able to explain the theoretical structures that I've developed so far, and then getting individuals after being typed with the metagram circuitry which I have and the metatype which I have, to see if they can confirm if the overlay of metagram and metatype is a valid overlay. Because in some sense, all I know about metagram is that it has the sequence of emotional tones, but I don't know I don't know for sure where they start on metatype. I always presumed that because the basic unit, after some development, but the basic unit was six, that there were six consecutive sequential things, uh, and then I always knew that the reason even why I expanded into the six was because I knew that it would be more than six. There would likely be more than six, but because I had found, I had been able to just purely in terms of metagram find the length of the pattern before it recurs again being six, that then that could be expanded into any other number. It could grow out from six. So, but I don't know where it should be positioned, and I am within my refined understanding of my refining progress in understanding metatype and understanding and getting a nice ontological narrative and story around the development of the false ego complex, blah blah blah. Um, so what I before assumed was just that, because I had a rather simple view of metatype, was that they were um, even originally I only had three sides of the mind. I didn't even have four sides of the mind. The superego, I actually spoke about the superego, and I just presumed that it was not part of the other three sides of the mind, and that's true and untrue. So it's weird how I have developed a lot of thinking which has the conservation of those concepts and the revisiting of those things are an interesting aspect of it anyway, or I could just sound like a crackpot. But anyway, the so anyway, in my revised metatype model now, that leads me to doubt that I don't know where the sequence begins, because traditionally I thought, well, each side of the mind just has six component parts, and I've got these six recurring things, or I've got this pattern, this basic pattern of six. So let's say at the start of the first metatype side of the mind will be the start of the pattern. But ontologically now I've developed the story within metatype that the false ego complex only properly develops after the dominant function in the subconscious develops. And so it might make sense that actually the dominant function in the subconscious, or even the parent function in the subconscious, might be the beginning of the chain. And then it could go from the parent function up, and then and it could even loop back around, in that the dominant function of the subconscious becomes, in some sense, the last, becomes the first becomes the same as the last in some sense, because I don't know, within a certain kind of mathematical recurrence, it might be that the beginning of the chain. Anyway, I mean, I haven't looked at all the mathematical permutations of this between the different gunas, because the different gunas have a slightly different internal ordering in their sequence. But it might just be that there is a particular pattern in which, maybe the first emotional tone is the parent function in the subconscious, and then essentially that is like the first cycle, and then it goes maybe from there 7 functions further, and then 2 functions. What would that go up to? Would that go up to the inferior function? Anyway, all right, let me just model it out. So let's just say to me it sounds a bit crazy to say that the first one would start at the parent function, but it's a possibility. But let me just say that, let's say the first function just starts at the dominant function, so that it would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So from the dominant function to the dominant function of the subconscious up through the unconscious to the dominant function in the ego makes 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then the parent function in the ego would be the 10th. Did I even count that right? Yeah, I think I did. So that makes 10. That's, anyway, yeah. But anyway, even if that is the band of 10, which I do suspect that is the band of 10, I don't know where the pole position is. I don't know where the start of the recurring sequence should be, because I've just got this pattern of 6. And so within the 10, that pattern will recur, but I don't know where the pole position should be. I don't know where the starting block is in that sequence of 10. So anyway, that has to, I don't know how I'm going, that I don't think is going to be capable of being theoretically espoused and coordinated or triangulated or anything like that. That will have to sort of come from empirical confirmation, I guess. But anyway, moving on. Now, this is very embarrassing to say. I mean, I have said some things about cognitive functions. Sorry, not cognitive functions. I've said some things about my emotional tones, my Metagram emotional tones, which have actually been just utterly wrong. And that's because, this is only embarrassing, is because in my notes, which are 2013, so this is, wow, that's 8 years ago now. Anyway, so in my Metagram notes from 8 years ago, I was extracting, I was reading some of the, I was looking at the patterns of the actual circuitry in particular Metagram types, which is in my tables and in my notes is attributed um, as the elements, as the alchemical elements, which are generic within each. Which actually, no, that is a clerical error. Yeah, so these notes that I have, in some sense, well, it's a clerical error because, in some sense, it's just this table is actually not. This table, I mean, it is true to the alchemical elements, but it's but those alchemical elements are misleading, except if you have a codex to decode them. And in some sense, there's no simple way of making a codex to decode them because, um, except by knowing independently the definition of each the definition of each emotional tone. So, for example, like on sattva, it's got all the different sattva types. Um, Actually, the heading is sattva, but it's actually rajas because I've changed the titles. But anyway, that's not a clerical error. That's just an update in theory. But okay, so let me look at sattva as I just mentioned it though. So for example, my type, first angry 8, annoyed and confused as the stimulus. The primary counteroffer is angry, and the emergent response is worried and cautious. And angry is these things are, well, I can't say defined, but or in some sense they are defined in brackets with the alchemical element. So annoyed is does is greater than should, confused is would is greater than should, angry is greater than would, and worried um, is should is greater than is, and cautious is would is greater than is. Um, and there is no, and then at the bottom of the page I've got is liberty, does is instinct, should is placidity, would is faith, which are particularly, those are the names of particular cognitive functions. And if you just plug in those cognitive functions into these alchemical elements, that's not the definition of that's not the definition of the emotional tone. The definition of the cognitive, and so I mean this has actually been misleading me for a long time when thinking about it, when trying to approach the subjects, and which I've now, at least I, is that the emotional tones are not made up of cognitive functions that come from the same guna in some sense. That if, in fact, then the definition of the gunas are much more complicated themselves because emotional. So if I've correctly attributed these columns to the gunas, to the in Hinduism, sattva, rajas, and tamas, which I still believe I have, um, and in some sense the revised now table that I'm making, I need to actually recapitulate a lot of my theory. It's actually worthy of me to go through and do a survey and just update and recapitulate it all into a handbook so that it's easier for me to have a reference to continue to. Yeah, I need to collate things. Just because this is getting a bit ridiculous. Um, I need to build some better halfway houses towards full integration. But anyway, but at least I have the semblance of that. You see, I used to have a word processor. I don't have a word processor anymore. Um, they make these things so annoying. Actually, maybe it would be worth it just to pay the bloody subscription. Anyway, so uh, So what should I say? Okay, so yeah, so for example, angry, which is a sattva tone, or I just keep on wanting to narrate this because one of the purposes of me making these recordings is just so that my work has a thread, so that somebody else might retrace it if need be. But so, for example, in these notes from 2013, it says rajas emotions. It should read sattva emotions, or at least in line with. And when it says sattva emotions, it should read rajas emotions. But anyway, okay. So the definition of angry is instinct is smaller than trust. So first dimension FE is smaller than 10th dimension extroverted intuition. That because first dimension FE is instinct and 10th dimension extroverted intuition is trust. So angry is that trust is greater than instinct. Um, Confused is the other way around. Confused is instinct is greater than trust. Okay. And so the thing here is that instinct is, you see, that is actually weird then, because you see I had associated 4 functions to sattva, which I now that definitional sort of thing that I had floating around in my head is essentially, I don't know if I could consider that true or not. You see, like what are those 3 groupings that I made out of the 12? Because you see, like there are. So this is going to get into a very interesting synthesis. So this is actually worth listening to this blather, because what I'm talking about is I'm going to get into generalizing it into very, very interesting things. Um, Talking about emotional tone circuitry, which is basically karmic circuitry. It's I call them field circuits, but I haven't started talking about the field circuits yet. Okay, so originally, and I still don't know why I did this, because now I can't actually find a foothold for the reason for doing it in my entire theory, which is a bit strange. But basically, there are 12 cognitive functions that make up emotional tones out of the 17 model. So I call the leftovers the final 5, and the reason why they are not part of emotional tones is because they are literally too close to your awareness of awareness. They are too much. They are more like the subject, and the rest is the object. So the other 12 can be objects of thought, whereas the final 5 are kind of like the actual percipients. They are the actual agentic, sentient. Uh, uh, some sense they are the container that is containing the objects, or the anyway. So, which is an interesting correspondence as well with many occult type things. You know, the Rosicrucian Cross has 5 petals in the rose at the center, um, and also those 5 are made up of basically. Actually, it's strange because those 5 are only made up of 4 of the things that are mentioned in First John chapter 5, because 3 of them are the Trinity: the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and one of them is the blood, and another one of them is something that is special but isn't part of anything. It's not the Spirit, and it's not the 5th one. There is not the Spirit, and it's not the water. The spirit and the water are actually part of the 12 that get used. So anyway, they get used to make up emotional tones. But anyway, that's a kind of esoteric layer of description of these things. But and I've made recordings where I talk ad nauseum about the philosophical, metaphysical sort of import of the Holy Ghost and the Word and the Father and all those sorts of things. Anyway, So, uh, so if you take these 12 emotional tones, you can objectively do some interesting things with them because, at least in terms of how I've defined them. So, in some sense, there are four what tones, there are four how tones, and there are four why tones. So, how, what, why. And you can stick all the hows together, all the whys together, and all the what's together, and there'll be one in each alchemical element. There'll be an is, there'll be a will, there'll be a should or a shall, and an ought or a would. And it's actually easier for me to say shall and ought because that that's the you see I don't want to repeat the thing that I always repeat. I have to give a little lecture every time I mention those last two because those last two are ambiguous when spoken of in speech because you don't know if you are if you don't know in if I'm speaking them in the first person or speaking them as a second person question. Anyway, it's grammatically ambiguous. You actually have to sort of take it contextually, sort of interpret it or this is why some people don't like reading certain types of style of narrative for an author because when it's actually when the narrator, the voice of the wording in the text is a first person narrator. It can be very strange sometimes. I mean, some people who don't know how to write yet, and they break their own style, where they are the narrator who speaks about events in the past tense as if they are omniscient, or if they're first person past tense, or are they first person present tense, uh, in a narrative, almost like their stream of, like they are literally voicing the stream of thought of the subject. Should I even say subject? Oh, anyway, so it's is it first person from the point of view of the person having the stream of thought, or is it referring to it in the past? So they're referring to themselves almost as a kind of as a third person object in their own stream of thought, which is in some sense still a stream of thought, but it's a stream of thought that is emulating their own memory. So and in some sense that's a very good metaphor also, just by the by, between the different perspectives of the sides of the mind, because the one is an ego perspective, your conscience perspective, talking from your first person perspective in the past tense, as if everything already happened and you are telling the story. You are in the valence of perceiving the uh, your soul becomes a story, to be judged essentially, which can only be judged in the past tense. And the anyway, I don't want to talk about the different sides of the mind. That's not. But essentially, this is the problem with shall and ought in some sense, because when you actually use them to talk to someone in the second person, um, am I even using that phrase right, in the second person? What shall we do today? What ought we do today? It's almost synonymous in that context, because in some sense, whether it's the first person or whether it's the second person, the person knows the context of what I'm asking. So it's like, if I ask you what ought we do, I'm asking you what do you think we should do. So if I ask what ought, it means in your first person what should. And the reason why I think a lot of the time there is linguistic ambiguity around these sorts of things is because um, people have different cognitive proclivities or preferences process because they have different emotional tones. And so the language itself has mirrored the need of, let's say, that there are different types of parsers in the PARSER. We are parsers in a different um, processing computational. Uh, I'll say something pejorative. Grift. We're each in our own particular slew of grifting in order to maintain um, the cohesion and, let's say, the integrity and perhaps the honor and the self-regard of our own emotional tone circuitry, which is in some sense the heart of the Tin Man, which is the heart of the unconscious side of the mind. Um, and without having a strong Tin Man, you have you have a breakdown of communication, quite frankly, as well. Um, now, Now, that what I just said might also be regarded as slightly speculative. I have not yet to discover or come across another strategy, although I think that you have to somewhat make peace with the Tin Man, and I think that you basically, the thing is that the Tin Man will always be, in some sense, suboptimal. It will always be deficient in some sense, and you have to be conscious of its deficiency, and you have to make allowances. You have to sort of, to err as human. But in some sense, this is ameliorated, I believe, through the correct uh, development of awareness. Let's just say, look, I'm not actually being cynical. I'm not. I'm just. There's an important synthesis that to me relates to a lot of things that I've been listening to. I was watching two lectures, not two discussions on the Stoa between two sets of people on a subject matter which is almost, two sides of the same coin. And I must say, I think that they are all in need of the thing that I'm studying or something like that. But and I'll go into that slightly. But it was interesting that the host of one of the discussions, they were really getting into talking about jazz and music and things like that. And I mean, I can understand that it's a useful illustration, sort of the living memory of the actual the medium of the flow of culture, and let's just say the actual process of being a participant in a fluid organic sort of thing. And I would just like to um, the host said something quite interesting about how I mean I might get this slightly wrong because I don't know who the people that they're referring to, but that the one of his all-time favorite musicians was respected the distinction between the secular and the sacred, or something like that, or perhaps maybe the implication there was that he was a secular artist, but that, and then in his opinion, or also that the experience of the music was divine, or was it actually dissolved the distinction between the sacred and the divine. Now I just want to point this out, that this is exactly the problem. This is not this is not a model of the solution. This is a model of every corrupt revolution. This is the model of, because the boundary is not maintained, the boundary is dissolved. That people, they try to have their cake and eat it. They anyway. And I look, I understand that this is a horrible thing to say about music. Oh, but okay, bear with me. Okay, I'm going to retouch on that because I'm not going to be able to finish that point without getting through other subject matter. But the, to bring into my discussion, the other discussion that I saw, and I didn't meticulously watch this whole conversation. I just saw bits of it. So I might be missing some context. But Evan McMullen, wait, I think I might have his surname wrong. But anyway, his he spoke about the trade-off um, between that there are two ways of organizing society or something like that, and he used the metaphor, the analogy, or there are two ways of having any kind of organization of coordination or something like that. Is that either you have people who are plugged in to a platform which is designed to be convenient and it's not very transparent, and you have to sort of, and if you don't know how to use your computer, you can go and find the solution to that problem, and hopefully someone has created a tutorial or a guide, and hopefully the system itself has that built-in functionality or something like that, that you can do what you want. Whereas in some sense there is, if you don't find any joy in terms of, I might be slightly butchering the actual thesis that he was raising here and the actual sort of trade-off that he was raising here, um, but it was at least intuitively something like this. And then the alternative is that you just get into Linux, in which you have to know exactly how the components, the hardware components of a computer work, because the interface is much more transparent and honest, and in some sense, but it forces you to have a lot more specific knowledge in order to interface and to operate it effectively. And sometimes I think that this dichotomy is also slightly incorrect, because it's not as if there aren't many different Linux halfway houses that are, in some sense, trying to emulate Windows and things like that. But anyway, uh, but and he was somewhat, I think the general synthesis that he was saying is that most people are going to be in the first camp. We can't expect everyone to use Linux. If we say that everyone who uses a computer must be capable of using Linux and understanding things transparently, then we're going to cut out the legs from people. We're going to take away their ability to do things. Now, I'll just point something out, something that I don't see Evan talking too much about, and something that I think that he perhaps overlooks because he's got a scapegoat that he can complain about or something like that, in terms of, oh, it's the evil capitalistic oligarchs or something like that, or it's the system itself is just a kind of trap in which everyone is trapped within or something like that, and we need to blame those with power, that kind of generalization and over reduction of the problem, rather than the idea that it's the people themselves who have ensnared themselves into using the windows and sort of finding themselves in an evolutionary cul-de-sac, and then not knowing how anything comes to be structured and eventually deployed or marketed, says, well, this isn't good enough for us, we want something better. Like the like the 99% people, like the Occupy Wall Street people. That the idea is that, okay, well, we want a better financial system. We don't know anything about finance. We're not willing to build an alternative financial structure. We just want you to knock down what you've done and build it in something that appeases our interests. Not that we know how to appease our own interests, because even if we go and build our own Bitcoin, where does that get us? It gets us, to be quite frank, absolutely nowhere. Decentralized Bitcoin still has the same problem, that you have these robber barons which can absolutely dictate the value of Bitcoin. There are people that have so much Bitcoin that in collusion with each other, they can precipitate, I mean, I know about this, that they do this, in fact, that they artificially create scarcity and abundance, and then they use that to fleece the general sort of trading market and its value and such. Because that's a market mechanic which you'll never be able to solve unless you actually have some kind of regulatory algorithmic structure, or if you have exchange controls, you'll have to impose some kind of exchange control. And as soon as you do that, it's no longer currency. As soon as you do that, then you have to essentially say, well, yeah, well, the reason why we're putting up with something that doesn't give you the same control that cold hard capital or cold hard currency gives you is because you're part of a culture. So in some sense, you become more of an identity within a very fixed role system, within a very, which is not going to scale, which is not going to work on an international level. That will only work if you want to go live in a unit of 150 people or something like that. It's not even worth thinking about. There's no, that we can't live like that. It's going to be primitive. It's going to be nasty. And it's also going to essentially rob people of, they're just basically going to anyway. My solution to all this stuff, both sides of the coin, in some sense, both discussions, is that we need a level playing field. We need a framework. We need a structure. We need rules, as it were. We need law, in fact. We need to have the same law. And it's not as if that, well, if we all have the same law, then by definition it'll be the perfect law. No, that doesn't mean that it can't refine itself. That doesn't mean that it can't be honest about its own sort of incapacities or its own humility. But at least then we're on the same planet, quite frankly. And without that same stand, I mean, this is what religion used to provide for a society, is that we would all, essentially, we would all belong to the same higher power, right? The same theme of adjudication, the same quality of invigilation, and that created a shared ethos. Now, within a multi-religious society, you can still have that as long as you have the same secular target of integrity and law. That does mean that we actually do need to refine values, secular values. We do need to have shared values. If we don't have shared values, it is de facto war already. And in some sense, I would argue that America is in a de facto constitutional crisis, but it's a separate recording that I've made, and it's worth looking at it as an independent inquiry. But anyway, now the reason why I bring this up is because let me talk about it developmentally a bit, and then I'll revisit these subjects now. So once we develop, and let me just say, I mean, this is slightly speculative, but I think I'm probably right. Lots of people, I believe, are developmentally stunted, quite cripplingly so, for want of being properly developmentally played out in their circuitry. I do actually think that you do require a certain size of play group, I would say, to actually become a fully developed person. You need a certain variety, I would even argue, as well. Now, some of what I'm about to say is at least speculative, but I would say that essentially looking at the different signatures of people's cognitive functions and things like that, what I think happens is that their tin mans get compressed. And the only way to decompress the tin man circuitry is to involve yourself with other people that have different circuitry that slots in around you, so that in some sense you know who's who in the zoo, so and anyway, actually, what that point that I made actually was more relevant when I had that other model of Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. Which I've also made a drawing about, but okay, let me not confuse this. When I was actually confused about this. Okay, yeah, I thought I could talk about decompression, but actually it's not even supported by my current view of the model, so actually I should just jettison talking about that. I'll have to see. I didn't actually finish that tangent when I was trying to say, well, what is the basis of me making those groupings? Because I have historically always made those groupings, which now don't conform to the gunas. So I don't know what they conform to. Why did I always define these groupings as being distinctly... No, wait, no. The groupings are actually... let me just look at the definitions. Instinct, placidity, faith, liberty. Yes, no, the groupings are still there. Yeah. Okay, no, the groupings are represented in the emotional tones. Okay, so you could still summarize each emotional tone as as each guna having those 4 emotional tones as being canonical. Okay, yeah, so the decompression stuff does still hold. Okay, so basically, if you are not exposed to the other gunas and other emotional tones from those gunas that, let's say, slot in, what you end up doing, I would say, is because you see each guna itself is not just connected to its own cognitive functions. It does have relays to other cognitive functions. Obviously, that will be also, not all of them, but at least the ones in which you have an emotional tone connected to that field. And there are 4 fields, and I want to talk about those fields because actually, to tell you the truth, what I know about those fields themselves is an independent breakthrough in a lot of fucking things. It is actually amazing. In some sense, it is the exact... In Hinduism, they talk about 4 different types of people within the 3 gunas. I can't remember all the titles. So it's like the Kashtriya, the Vastriya. I can't. They kind of sound like that, and it's like, when Arjuna is talking to Krishna, Krishna says, "Oh, you're a kind of, you're a something, Vaish, uh, you're a warrior, but you're also something, but you're like a saintly warrior, or you're like almost like you're half a priestly kind of, because it's like anyway, it's a bit, and I believe that those 4 things will, probably correspond to these 4 things, these 4 field circuits, which is why people are hybrid, because they at least have 3 emotional tones, and those 3 emotional tones will at least be on 2 different fields. So people will at least be a hybrid of more than 1 field. And there are very, very rarely, there are some types that have emotional tones in all 4 fields. Mine is one of them, which I guess can sound like I've just tried to make myself very special. But anyway. So what I was saying is that compression then would happen is when you are used to getting your way in some sense, and you are used to your so the analogy here is that your actual circuitry gets compressed, and it's very blithely sequentially flowing from one to the other. It's not taking its patience to read the field. It just wants to get to the next link in its own internal chain. And so, yeah. And I would say that people that have gaps in the developmental armor, again, that's a bit of a mixed metaphor, but anyway, because they didn't have a certain influence um, in their play group or whatever, then I think that they might even get a kind of decompression blind spot. Again, horrible mixed metaphor, but you maybe get the picture. Is that then you become hardened. You become natively. Um, you can't even pick up that stone anymore. You can't even look under that stone because you're just so used to having your cake and eat it, of having that emotional tone sequentially move on to the next emotional tone without actually seeing the field that that emotional tone is a part of and being sensitive to the other emotional tones that share that field. Now, it's very interesting because, for example, okay, I can talk about the anatomy of these fields now with actually, I haven't thought about it too much because I've written out a nice model of it, and I just thought, oh, that's such a beautiful summary of it because it's never popped for me like it has now. So in the first field, the Rajasic tones are anxious and bashful. The Sattvaic tones are angry and confused, and the Tamasic tones are lazy and terrified. Sorry, no, is that lonely and terrified? Excuse me, lonely and terrified. Um, and uh, anxious and bashful are just made up of the 15th dimension exuberance and the first dimension instinct. And whether instinct is greater, um, then it's bashful, and then it's anxious, and when exuberance is greater, then it's bashful. Um, so when exuberance, the 15th dimension exuberance, as introverted sensing, is greater than instinct, uh, it's bashful, and when instinct is greater than exuberance, then it's anxious. Because instinct is what will be, and exuberance is what things are, or what things mean, or what things are like. Those are all the long form formulations of exuberance. So anyway, pretty decent ways of formulaically, prepositionally describing it. Anyway, uh, then the in the first field again, sattva is instinct and trust. Instinct being the first dimension, what will be, and trust being the 10th dimension, what things shall be, or what things shall be like, or what things should be. So how you trust things. So what things should. So extroverted thinking is trust, is extroverted thinking. So when when trust is greater than instinct, then you're angry, and when instinct is greater than trust, then you're confused. So when what things will be are greater than what things shall be, or what things should be, or what things should be like, when what will be is greater than what things should be like, then you're confused. And when what things should be like is greater than what things will be, then you're angry. Sorry, did I just say what things will be like? It should actually always just be what things will be. Anyway, what things will be. It doesn't really matter. Anyway, and then tamas is trust and exuberance. And so in tamas, if trust is greater than exuberance, then you're terrified, and if exuberance is greater than trust, then you're lonely. If what things are is greater than what things should be, then you're lonely, and if what things should be is greater than what things are, then you're terrified. by the way, I mean, these things might be, so my definition of these things, I mean, like, I've, in some sense, I'm not using the vernacular definition of these emotional tones because these are cognitive inflections. And also, I would argue that this might be a closer essence of these things. If you want to come up with 24 distinct emotional tones, that when you drill down to it almost philosophically, that, being terrified is interesting. How people, the grimace, the perhaps the not quite a vacant stare, but it's like a kind of vigilant vacancy. It's kind of like an oxymoron, but. Well, obviously, many people react to being terrified many different ways. But I mean, people that have a terrified emotional tone in their circuitry is they often have a kind of low key mania. They are often kind of very they have a punctuated sort of quite high tempo in some sense, but you don't see the metronome running. So it's somewhat concealed internally. By the way, I use the word greater than just for brevity, but in some sense, I've always considered the greater than types. This might be. I haven't been drawing distinction to this. I have been. The definition of these emotional tones is more complicated because technically, lonely and terrified are not just oppositely charged. In some sense, I make a distinction between when one is greater than the other and when one is lesser than another. The one does not include the other. But sorry, I'm trying to talk about this my strange sort of jargon in some sense. But if I read the actual the long form notation, which I have not been going into, which it's going to be too long to go through it. But essentially, for example, lonely. Lonely is experiencing a sense of what things will be like, distinguished by a stronger sense of what those things mean. So, so that would be exuberance is greater than trust. But terrified, which is trust is greater than exuberance, says experiencing a sense of what things would be like, distinguished by an absent sense of what those things mean. So in terrified, it's not the exuberance is lesser than, it's actually negated, it's obviated. It's being taken up by the trust, by the sense of trust. So there's a negative exuberance. It's not a lesser than exuberance, it's a negative exuberance. Whereas the first lonely is not negative trust. It's just being led. The trust is being led by the exuberance. So anyway, that's a very nuanced point, and I'm not going to be able to talk through all of those things. But anyway, in fact, I'm just going to briefly go through the other ones. So, in the second field, the Rajasic ones are eager and rushed, and they have to do with prudence and placidity, which are both how functions. Prudence, how things will be, and placidity is how things shall be, which is actually the one that is this placidity is spirit, is understanding itself. The Sattvic functions are elated and scared, which is appraisal, which is the eighth dimension, and placidity again. Placidity is how things ought to be, and tamas is relieved and sad, which is appraisal, how things ought to be, juxtaposed against, again, placidity, how things shall be. And so it's interesting is that the first two field functions, the first two field circuits, like just going back a second, the first field circuit only has what functions in it? What is, what will, and what should. exuberance, instinct, and trust are all what functions. And in the second field function, the second field circuit, they're all how functions. How will, how should, and how shall, and how ought. And although this is I don't have the time, I haven't double checked this meticulously, but you could actually order each thing in the field circuit in order of from top to bottom, because these cognitive functions are not equal. They are one of them is deeper than the others, because if you order them from top to, because essentially, I number each cognitive function within the 17 model. So I've got these drawn out in over the model of 17. And so if you number them from highest to lowest, the what is the first, the what shall is the second, and the what will is the last, because it's the lowest. And I believe that if you go through people's types and you were to see how they were treating each of these numbers, in some sense, which one is dominant, which one is the greater than. And if you count out in somebody's cognitive stack, which, if you look at their emotional tones and you pick out which of the cognitive functions are greater than in each of them, and you work out which pole position they take, then I think that might correspond with something as basic as what is described in Enneagram as SX, SO, and SP, or technically it's not really, I don't know if it's part of Enneagram, but it's always usually expressed in conjunction with Enneagram because it gives you a very good overall sort of archetype of what someone is like. And I do think that ought, because in some sense SX would then be the most intimate and personal, SO would just be sort of the middling, and SP would be the most basic element within that circuit, would be the most crude, the most coarse. And so that's how I see this playing out. I see this playing out as that you could do an analysis of someone's type, of their cognitive functions, and obviously, of their emotional tones. Some emotional tones might stand out more than others, but I'll only be able to confirm once I understand the overlay, because obviously the emotional tone that is being used by your dominant function in your metatype is probably going to be more prominent, and it's probably going to be, let's say, your leading function, which is what, look, usually when people are described as SX, SO, or SP, the instinctual variants, they are given two. They are given a primary and a secondary. And so anyway, I just thought I'd mention that because it's an interesting overlay. The third, now it's interesting because the third and the fourth fields functions are much more mixed. They don't just have one thing, they have two things. So in the third field function, it's how is and why should and why would, or why ought and why shall. So the third field function, each of these field functions is made up of three things. It's made up of three things. Three cognitive functions make up each field circuit. So it's amazing that essentially the 12 can be divided into, certain sets of cognitive functions, and then they can be divided again into other sets of cognitive functions, which is why we have the separate Tin Man karmic Maya, why we have confusion, why we have murkiness and delusion. That's why we have this quality of illusion, is because the circuits the actual constituent elements of the circuits themselves are misleading. They will mislead people. They'll even mislead people in terms of their own compression of their own cognitive circuitry. Because if you follow the circuit, it's not notionally understandable. It's not soluble. It's just a property. It's a function of, in some sense, of mindless creatures. These things do not have minds of themselves. They're not agents. It is to confuse the medium with the message, essentially. and there is no message to be found in the medium itself, other than it is a creature. It just is it, it's like what we should consider in law, what we should consider legislation. Is that legislation is merely a creature. It should not be the heart of the law, the core of the law, the substance of the law. The substance of the law must always be with regard with principle. And general objective criteria and sets of very well thought out structures that are held loosely in a bank of principles. Anyway, so the third field includes bored and condescending and calm and lazy. So bored and condescending is rajasic, annoyed and worried is sattvaic, and calm and lazy is tamasic. And bored and condescending has to do with faith and eminence. Faith, the 13th dimension, why things ought to be. Eminence, the 6th dimension, why things shall be. So whether one is over the other, you're either bored or condescending. Sattva is faith and tranquility, faith being why things ought to be, and tranquility being how things are. And so whether how things are or faith is greater than the other, it's either annoyed or worried. And tamas is calm and lazy, between tranquility and eminence, why things shall be and how things are. And so if the one is greater than the other, you're calm. If the other is greater than the other, then it's lazy. The fourth field circuit is excited and silly for rajas, shocked and cautious for sattva, and relaxed and shy for tamas. And rajas would be liberty and moderation. So if liberty, which is why things are, reason itself, if why things are is greater than moderation, which is what ought to be, your sense of suggestion, sense of moderation, what is suggestible to you, what you would suggest in terms of your inclination, it's very much the solar plexus sort of gut, where your serotonin is made. That the why things are being greater than moderation, or moderation being greater than what ought be, will either make you excited or silly. Sattva is why things are and why things. Okay, sorry, I didn't. So sattva, shocked and cautious, is made up of liberty again and hope, which is why things will be. The 9th dimension, why things will be hope, and the 12th dimension, why things are liberty, and whether one is greater than the other, you're either shocked or cautious. Tamas is hope and moderation. So why things will be for hope, or what ought to be for moderation. And if the one is greater than the other, or vice versa, you're either relaxed or shy. And so that's interesting, because I would say that I wonder if people, if they don't have any emotional tone on a particular field circuit, if they get that sense of affectation occluded from their repertoire of reactivity or dispensation of affectation, I wonder. That's very interesting. I just wanted to point out that for esoteric reasons, all emotional tones above dimension 11, including dimension 11 and above, are fundamentally problematic, especially the first field circuit. The first field circuit, and I believe that I'm looking at the problem, the first field circuit is the only field circuit in which sattva has no influence above dimension 10. Sattva has no presence above dimension 10 in the first field circuit. So that means that fundamentally, this is slightly speculative, but I actually think I'm on pretty firm ground saying these things, is that in all the field circuits, sattva either has the high ground or it has tie for the high ground, but not in the first field circuit. In the first field circuit, in fact, yeah. Anyway, and maybe this is just me quibbling about it. Maybe and maybe I'm just a sort of a sore loser that there are people flying over my head in the first field circuit, essentially, because I'm a sattva-ic type. But rajasic people in the first field circuit are acting beyond where the sattva can I'm using this word slightly metaphorically, monitor. And I will just say that it's not just that it's beyond where they monitor. Look, maybe I'm too much of a partisan to actually, I need to do some more careful thinking about this, but maybe this is just much too convenient and conjecturous from my point. But I really believe that people that are anxious or bashful, I believe that, let me try to make a stark, first I have to make an illustration first. Emotional tones are they are like creatures. They are like gremlins. They are like pixies. They have their own worlds unto themselves, and you shouldn't try to understand them from their own perspective, because you'll just go insane and you'll invent crazy bullshit. Okay, so that's one thing. You can compose your own mechanistic model out of them, but it's all sort of demonology or something like that, if I can put it like that. You can create a nice pantheon of all these natural occurring energies and things like that, and you can see all the ebbs and the flows, and you can try to create a pretty picture out of them and paint yourself into the middle of it. That's all fine, whatever, go be deluded. But I've just lost my train of thought. I'm still thinking about where I need to get to, and now I've lost my connection there. Because I want to talk about Egyptian pharaohs, but anyway, as an illustration to the other point. Oh yes, now I've got it. Okay, so the point is that these things are like the gift. Prophecy does not come from the material, from the scientific point of view. Prophecy doesn't come from science. Oh, this sounds so stupid. What I'm basically trying to say is that, like, you don't smell the wind and then suddenly you know what's going to happen in 10 years' time. It doesn't come to you uh, through a material conduit. It's coming to you through the ebbs and the flows of all this natural energy, but it's this cognitive matrix, um, these emotional tones, that you have a particular circuitry, or if you're a very young child and you don't have a circuitry yet, it's still in the middle of being formed, and therefore it's still kind of sensitive. It's very sensitive. The young will prophesy. Um, and those who still have access to that subconscious before the development of the dominant function. I mean, I mean, uh, you can keep that door open probably. So when you're dealing with the knowledge of good and evil, in a very primordial sense, in some sense, before Adam has eaten of the fruit of the knowledge, or the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you can that's the kind of sensitivity where you can kind of be smacked in the face with the emotional tone on the wind, and you can kind of be imprinted on, that you can feel the spin and feel of that influence, and know the fatalism corroded up into it. I I I was driving home soon from the gym, and I was thinking, wouldn't it be interesting to develop some political propaganda to try to diffuse the fascism of the current age, to try to create a evocative, emotive a painting and things like that might depict the irony and the to put the right emotional character of the people involved in creating the disgusting rhetoric that they make, and the disgusting uh, uh, sort of proto-fascist and overtly fascist claims that they make, as they are part of such a corrupt edifice and such. But and using even religious iconography to point out the stark, vacuous, and hypocritical, sort of stances that people are taking, to really, perhaps try to put the fear of God into people, into the politicians themselves, but also to signal to other people that they're essentially, in the artwork itself, the depiction that these people are starkly evil people, um, are starkly cultivating rage and resentment in order to facilitate their own nefarious, um, deceptive mode of trying to simply solve solutions, um, that will disguise their own malfeasance, um, and give themselves a liberal free hand of unaccountability, of which they have already enjoyed too much of. But anyway, why did I talk about that? So the reason why, and when I was thinking about that, I thought, I could write a poem that might do the same, and I just thought of the first two lines of the poem, which is relevant to what I'm talking about now. And what were the first two lines of the poem? I'm not sure exactly how the first article uh, is not an, anyway. No, it's not an art. Anyway, hope is the heading. Bearing the cursed course. Oh, that doesn't. The cursed course. Oh wow, that doesn't work because it's a homophone. But I did actually write it down and I did say it and it did work. So I guess you have to say the course, cursed course. Yeah, that was it. The course, cursed, bearing the course, cursed course. Hope is the heading, bearing the course, cursed course. Which is to emphasize that, first of all, I was thinking that, you can't have any intellectualism unless you are naked and wear on your sleeve, your heart on your sleeve, in terms of the hope that is the purpose, the teleological orientation, facilitating the discourse, or at least the medium. In some sense, hope is the host, even of any thought. It's under the heading of some hope, and in examining the hope itself, that the hope itself might be the wrong hope, is in some sense perhaps that every hope should come coordinated with it, the sub hope, that is there a better hope, and is this hope defective, so that there is a room for a quickening, there is a patience, for a redeveloped center of gravity. Anyway, let me just say that okay, so in the same way that, okay, the point of that poem was or the beginning of that poem perhaps, was to try to get people to think about hope in some way. But let me just say that that's fundamentally problematic for bashful and anxious people. Bashful and anxious people are totalitarian dictators. To be bashful or anxious, in some sense, I do actually think that bashful and anxious people how do I put this? I can't put this in a. And I'm talking about the emotional tone, bashful and anxious. Actually, maybe. Anyway, I mean, they're just as dangerous as terrified people and lonely people. In some sense, they are more dangerous because they will be more able to integrate their influence into making them normalized within culture and such and such. But there's something quite evil, I would even argue, about the alignment of the first dimension of psychological reality, the most crude, the most coarse, and the 15th dimension of psychological reality. Because if you can just be anxious or bashful about something, in some sense, there's no way to diffuse that. If that is if that emotional tone itself is compressed, and you do not allow for an intervailing. Anyway, within this field circuit, the only thing that can intervale is trust, is what shall be, what should be, what things should be like. Trust. So, anyway, there's this thing on the first field circuit, anxious and bashful, in which Sattva does not have a seat at the head of the table. And I would even be predictive of, essentially, because this 15th dimension of psychological reality is archetypally correlated with Malkuth, with the kingdom, what things are. It's a very esoteric. You only get to know what things are in above the integration. In some sense, it is the core. It is even deeper than the word itself. It is the first. Uh, Yeah, it's so esoteric. It's even above the light, So it's something that is even deeper than reason itself. I don't know how to describe this unless I don't even have probably the religious imagery of this, but it's because it's I mean it's directly below the Father. It's directly below the Father, um, and in some sense, it's something like the sons of God. I guess is actually probably the best way I can think of to describe the kingdom is the sons of God. Anyway, or the order of the angels, or something like that, or the ordering of something very esoteric. Um, anyway, and when people are anxious and bashful, they are linking that feeling of what things are directly with what things will be, or what will be. And they can't be, I don't think they can be placated. Well, in some sense, they can only be placated. They can't be negotiated with, rather. Um, and it is, I would argue, it is that tendency that is essentially the corruption of Saul, King Saul, who I would argue was a Rajas, and they keep on asking the question. I know I'm in disagreement with some theologians on that, but they keep on asking the question, and it is asked: is Saul one of the prophets? Anyway, that I've opened up a little bit of a conundrum, but let me rather tackle it in a more secular vogue. So, what was I talking about at the start? So I was talking about the need for law and justice in some sense, and the need for secular demarcation. Because I would argue that it is this anxious and bashful tendency what do you do with that? Without rules, if that anxious and bashful emotional tone does not have rules and to be the reflection of a conscience which they themselves can only know by structure, can only see reflected in systems that operate mechanically around them. And in some sense, there might be also other lacunas of other types, also sattvaic types. It's just that my point of saying that is that, in some sense, at least if you can match somebody else's use of the same cognitive function, you can show them another perspective. You can kind of shoehorn them into seeing things more broadly. But when other people are using a cognitive function which is simply higher than yours, you can't dissuade them because it's deeper, it's closer to their core. You're not talking their language. And so they're not going to believe you, essentially. Not unless they can see it eminently reflected in something around them, something that is entrenched or established, something that is already ingrained in some reflection of their own activity in some sense. And this is what the law provides, or what it rather can provide if it is done correctly. It's interesting, Jordan Hall complained that when Jamie Wheal spoke about bringing up something about fiduciary duties, and then Jordan Hall dismissed it, is that it's just not going to happen. That was perhaps, I think, a premature disassociation of a thread, which was, in my view, the most fruitful thread to delve into. But it's interesting that I would point out one of the interlocutors. I apologize not knowing the name of everyone, who mentioned that he felt. I don't want to. I don't want to exaggerate, but let me just say he felt slightly ostracized about everyone's indulgence into the music stream of history, as if, oh, why can't we all just start metaphorically enter into a stream of jazz and integrate all these things and have it be self, what are those phrases that I quite stringently despise, self-organizing, blah blah blah, all that sort of stuff, which I rail against in many of my recordings as essentially being the antithesis of anyway. I mean, I guess perhaps I fall foul of Jordan Hall's stricture, which he points out, which is a good metaphor, but I will continue to disagree essentially. But Jordan Hall says you can't give birth to a baby whose skeleton is fully formed and that doesn't have much else, that you need the soft tissues first, that you need a balance in the gestation or something like that. You can't just, finish the skeleton and then do the rest or something like that. And perhaps I'm coming on too strongly, but essentially there will come a time, at least, and perhaps it does need to percolate and try to, perhaps it does need a few abortions, a few failures before my words can start sounding more credible and sweeter, perhaps, in their peculiar phrases. But I would just say that the law is a very sophisticated thing to get the law right, to have truly the rule of law and not the rule of man. As far as I can tell, it's only ever been accomplished in one country in the history of the world, and that was in South Africa after 1994, and now it has been destroyed by institutionalized corruption. But we're the only country in the world that actually had an independent judiciary and a legal tradition that was actually capable of that had the structure on the books to have a, it's a, to have it is a space aged system. South Africa literally on the legal side of things has a space age system, and it's very hard to judge that, except if you probably look at the commentary that I have made over Lord Sumption's Wreath lectures, and also my criticism of the American legal structure, and my other sort of general comments about the framework of law and these sorts of things. But and it's perhaps not seen as important enough because people live in such decrepit and substandard cultural conditions as their culture has been cultivated along with a failed structure, with a fallen republic, with a republic that is in name only and does not function at all because it is prone to the Napoleonic corruption. Now, integrity, if it's not going to merely be turned into a kind of folkish generalization and oversimplification of rules of thumb and other disgusting forms of crude and half-witted gerrymandering and such, we're going to need to have a stomach to import quite a lot of skeletal structure. That you can see how you can organically coalesce around something, but I think there has to be actually quite a stomach for a structure that we don't know. I mean, I would argue that a lot of this bullshit around self-organizing, whatever bullshit keeps on being thrown about and talked about. The reason why I call that bullshit is that because we have no fucking clue how life evolved from base chemicals. I mean, do you know how fucking complicated a cell is? And supposedly we're supposed to believe that a proto-cell evolved from nothing into the complexity that cells have, when we can't even artificially produce a cell from chemicals. Like, supposedly we know what one looks like, but we cannot generate one from inorganic chemicals. The only way that they have even badly made cells from repurposing parts of living cells, essentially. They have not even been able to make the chiral chemicals needed to put together cells. I mean, it's fucking ridiculous. So somehow you think that we are going to be able to, in some sense, arrest the development of supposedly a doom spiral. I mean, again, I don't believe in arrest. I don't believe in. I'll say as well that I think that on both sides of the fence, of Evan McMullen and these other people, that they are aiming. They have the wrong aim entirely. Their aim is to save the world, is to save society at large. You do not speak for a democratic majority. You do not have a constituency that is anywhere close to the majority. The idea that you're going to get your hands on the levers of power is grotesquely overreaching, and the oversight in all of this armchair sociology is fucking disgusting. What you can hope to do is have a successful pilot, is to have a successful pilot social organizational structure which as a model functions and as a model can be scaled and emulated by other people, and that hooks into a decentralized integrated system of collaboration. Okay, that's the most you can kind of hope for, and hopefully that system of collaboration will actually seek to balance the default ulterior modes of existence. That you should be part of a liberal democratic capitalistic society, not trying to rock the boat, not trying to debase it, saying, well, if you don't want to do that anymore, then follow us. But otherwise, we'll help stabilize what you're doing because we don't want beggars on our doorstep. We don't want destabilization. We don't want people to blow up and then nationalize everything that we've actually successfully made. So you don't try to destroy things and rebuild them. You displace them by actual people choosing to do something different. And this is the problem. And this really is the problem, is that the problem is not the people at the top. Problem is not even the people at the middle, at the top of the middle. The problem is that people are where they're at because of, I mean, if you really want to save society, we really need people, never mind a consilience project, never mind any of these consilience things. Go study the Department of Education. Go study the theories that they're using and go look at the kind of bullshit indoctrination that crept in there, and that how they're spreading their proto-fascist nonsense and their feminist bullshit among people, gating their sexuality with ideological political strangeness, so that they can be part of this fascistic mob morality and mob mentality, which you think that you're going to be the sort of the armchair philosophy generals thereof, or there too, or something like that. That you're going to be the savior of the system. You're going to be the Führer of society and sociology. No, 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 no. I mean, come up with a curriculum and come up with a teaching program that you can get teachers to teach that curriculum or something like that. You know, can you bring up the average? Can you bring up the middle? Can you raise the standards in some sense? That would be a far more credible goal of rejuvenation in some sense. I mean, in order to put us on a better footing of being able to have a successful model flourish. And I would say that we're not close to the brink ecologically. I think that is all bullshit. I mean, the person who invented the computer models that is used by all the people who make environmental climate disaster cases says that the computer models are being used in a way in which it's ridiculous. Not to mention the incongruence with the basic facts of the ice core samples, with the basic facts that climate has always changed. The Egyptian agriculture fucking collapsed. It collapsed basically Rome as well. Egypt never used to look like it used to look at the moment. The Nile was really fucking fertile. It's not anymore. That had nothing to do with with CO2 emissions. The climate changes. Not to mention, we've been in a little ice age for like the last 500 years, which we're now coming out of. really. I mean, all this climate change stuff is so that big government can do big things and get people to recycle so that they can ignore actually organizing anything that's going to be effective about any issue that's actually important. An issue that would actually be important is stopping the pollution and the degradation of the seas, which is a much more important and vital ecological threat to the well-being of human beings on this planet than anything else, is the health of the seas. I mean, you get more CO2, you'll probably just get more algae, or you could even have an algal bloom if you really care that much about it. But actually, it's actually good that we have increased CO2. We probably need it. We'll have better yields. And if we just switch over to more regenerative agriculture, which means that we start eating more cattle, more meat with regenerative agriculture, we'll all be a lot healthier. The land itself will be more fertile. That's what you need to have regenerative agriculture. You need large herds of cattle. That's even how they reclaim mines now. You can have a barren wasteland because of mining operations, and as long as you feed if you get whole herds of goats even, and you feed them because there's nothing there for them to eat, the goats will make the mining area that was wasted into a fertile grassland. You don't need to probably leave land fallow for 10 years if you just bring in a big herd of cattle. Regenerative agriculture, it's that simple. More, not less. You can actually increase the carrying capacity of land. You see, all the strange sciences and things like that, I don't even know what they call it, biological conservation or whatever. It's all plugged into this program bullshit. I mean, I believe it's actually a principle in that biological conservation. I don't know what the field is called. That actually you cannot raise that the carrying capacity of the land is static. It just is a certain. You make certain measurements so that you can determine what that carrying capacity is, and that is it. I mean, that's how. I mean, it just shows you that essentially society is only as agile as, in some sense, its slowest cog in terms of at least the functional side of things. And there just aren't enough clever people to go around. Is the basic truth. We don't have enough human intelligence. Uh, or we have a glut of it in certain industries, perhaps, and it just there are practical challenges that can easily be solved, but you can. It's a lopsided distribution of sort of wasteful, and in some sense, I mean, this is because the crisis is not so much a real crisis. It's a crisis of the mind. It's a cultural crisis. It's much more ephemeral. I mean, they call it the meaning crisis. What is the meaning of the meaning crisis? Crisis. That actually seems like a knife that can cut itself and maybe reach some resolution. But yeah, I mean, people seem to not have the actual intention to get something actionable. They want something that is secure and guaranteed, and that analytically sort of means that they're on the right side. And nothing is like that. You actually have to just do something that is complete in itself in some sense, and that is not guaranteed to succeed, and you have to hope that it succeeds. And there's no guarantee, and yes, you might be infiltrated by the deep state or something like that. Well, just try to conduct yourself in such an open way that you won't be derailed. Yeah, I mean, yes, you can always create a boogeyman in your head as to why you have to become a Leninist instead. I mean, that was essentially Lenin's basic thing, like as in Dante's, or in the Divine Comedy, the devil is encased in a frozen ice tomb. That is the lack of hope, the atrophy of articulation, of embodiment, that the embodiment is petrified of hope, that it is cast in a frozen casket. But anyway, I guess I didn't make that point quite clearly or useful enough. But I mean, the point is basically that I mean, for me, I find it quite sickening that people won't just model a tentative solution and then actually. I mean, it's not as if we haven't got failed experiments. There's the Osho commune that was failed. Why do these? I mean, I guess that was practically always a bit of a disaster. They had supposedly they had the right spirits, but they didn't have a proactive, productive model, and they weren't happy being menial, perhaps, or being a commune of beggars. They probably could have profited from having a law, a sophisticated enough law, and an understanding of the law of contract enough to know that, well, they should have had their ducks in a row. They should have had some contracts that they could have used to structure and maintain uh, lines of because in some sense, I mean, unless you're going to do everything in house, if you're going to depend on the outside world, I mean, again, this is why I think that it's actually a good test to see how integrated you can be with capitalism, and to exist and to transcend beyond and above it, but not to destroy it, but to live within it, but not be a part of it, or at least to have that as your aim, to not be a part of it, and in that way not be a part of it, even as you do perhaps do some kind of participation in some sense, especially until you can do everything in house, or do everything in house between your different, in some sense, if you have a decentralized integrated system that can trade with each other, it doesn't need to trade with itself, because it could just use the local economy to essentially sell and buy from the local market, because then you don't have to deal with the longer transport or something like that. And then if but it's always good to have the capacity of being self-sufficient. And so having that capacity, I would say, is would be at least the aim. Obviously, if everyone starts emulating you, copying you, but in some sense, again, like a different model of society I mean, in some sense, it's all about cultural reproduction at the end of the day. Um, but yeah, I don't think, I mean, look, my goal is very simple. It's basically Star Trek. And we are going to have to evolve as a species, and that evolution is going to be a moral evolution. It's going to be a normative evolution. It's going to be a cultural technology. It's going to be based on values. Anyway, I'm going to stop this recording. I've gone on long enough. Okay, I need to clean up a point that I was trying to make, which I didn't articulate that well. So let me just retouch it. Talking about the pharaohs and the bashfulness and the anxiousness and the anxiousness. So anxious and bashful are both emotional tones that are rajasic, and they both are associated with what I archetypally related to Malkuth, or exuberance, or the kingdom, which I, as a cognitive function, I call it exuberance, the 15th dimension. It's a form of extroverted sensing, and the long form of that is what things mean, or what things are, or what things are like, or something like that. Now, I've already said that, this is problematic. And the reason why I link it to Egypt is because I think that this is a point that I think many Christians might even know. It might even be in sort of when in the story of the Jews leaving Egypt, if I'll just phrase it like that, the crux of it was not that Pharaoh wouldn't let them go. It was how Pharaoh wouldn't let them go, to kind of put it like that. Because the thing was is that Moses only ever left it with Pharaoh as his word, as his bond, as his spoken word, and essentially and this is why, in some sense, I say that all people who use these emotional tones of anxiousness and bashfulness are essentially pharaohs in some sense. Now, that's not technically probably true, because it also depends on where the bashfulness and the anxiousness might be contained within the circuitry. It might, because they are anyway, but that there might be some parts of where the anxiousness and bashfulness might be, anxious and bashful tones might be, that it might actually not be such a train smash. There's more of a train smash maybe when it has to do with parent functions, or when it has to do with dominant functions, or something like that. And when it has to do with child functions, it might not be such a problem. But anyway, that's a technical distinction, not important. The main thing that I'm saying is that the cognitive function, the 15th dimension, what things are, what things mean. This is the reason why this is a dangerous function for someone to have. I mean, obviously, there's nothing someone can do about it. If they develop this kind of cognitive circuitry, that's the cognitive circuitry that they're developing into. But the reason why it becomes a problem sociologically, if I can put it like that, is because if at a very young age, people are not in a culture in which what things mean is already established with some kind of secular robustness, or within a mystery tradition, or something like that, within a robust framework in which there are very clearly established institutions of things like normative values and ethics and things like that. If there aren't ports of call to orientate oneself and see the structure of things, but if you instead don't have the right number of play partners of the right variety, or whatever, and you have a developmental arrested development in your cognitive circuitry, and you end up with compressed circuitry or whatever, that your sequitur flow between the bashfulness and the anxiousness and the next proceeding emotional tone, or vice versa, from a preceding from some subsequent emotional tone going into bashfulness, and that you just want to jump into it, that you have, what you have essentially done is you have, and this is going to sound quite stark, you have displaced the kingdom of God, or you have spoken for it, or you have conjectured it in a private sense. You have privately modeled it, or something like that. And as I say, like, without a robust, even metaphysical sort of thing, it's a very sort of dangerous thing to speak for Malkuth, or to what things are, uh, and to imagine that, and in some sense, I mean, some Jews, I think, have linked this even to the necessity for the Messiah to develop a new language and things like that. Um, uh, you know, I'll just link this as well to some Christian themes which are interesting. But in the New Testament, when it says that God writes the law on your heart, what has been quite disgusting in the modern era is the derision and dilution of essentially the archetype and what words mean. Even the ancient peoples did not imagine that the brain had any kind of intellect in it. The Egyptians famously, would fish out the brain with a hook, because it was just essentially like a mass of snot, essentially. That was what the brain was conceived of. It was the organs in the chest, which were very, very meticulously preserved, um, as being the house of the essence of the intellect, of the wisdom, of the knowledge. That was all associated with the heart. That the heart was the center of your was the core of your of why things ought to be some way. Your intuition, your faith, which was an intellectual uh, uh, way of seeing how things operate, and was your model of the world, and how to participate in it. So the chest, the core of the chest, the heart, was essentially the driving engine that gives you the impetus to engage and participate. And so they didn't have this fractious, sort of disassociation between intellect and will. Uh, that hope was probably understood, which is why greetings were also so important in some sense. That people declare their intentions, that people declare through their word the import and significance and the wavelength of the interaction that is about to occur, which they are. Anyway, so in some sense they were a lot more grounded, is what I'm sort of saying. Anyway, the point of me talking about this is that when God says that he will write the law on your heart, that does not mean, in the New Testament, that does not mean that the law is changeable. It does not mean that the law is fickle and that it is changing with how you feel. It has nothing to do with the feeling of what is right. It's still the knowledge and understanding of what is right. It's just so heart has taken a hit in cultural speak. The word heart, the meaning, the archetypal, what is a heart, has become, quite facile and stupid. And also faith itself has also become facile and stupid. And that's an interesting correlation that I'll just point out. Okay, so there's that. And you get a very good sense of this if you were to study the Roman Dutch substantive law, and if you were to study or how I've described it fitting together in all the legal sort of structures and things like that. And when I make the claim that South Africa is the only country in the history of the world that has actually had the rule of law in a normative values ethical system that is above the board, and that everything functions. I mean, we had the most excellent legal tradition in the world, even during apartheid, but because of the Constitution and because of those secular normative values, non-sexualism, non-racialism, but also just the formulation, the brilliant formulation of the Constitution, of the limitations clause in the Bill of Rights, in which all the rights are limited according to a system of arbitration in which you can, as an individual, stand up against the state, the leviathan of the state, and force the state to justify their infringement of the right. which is the only real protection you have. Because in America, that supposedly has absolute rights, you end up having no rights. Your rights are non-justiciable, effectively. Because try standing up and saying that you shouldn't be income taxed because it's an infringement of your right to pursue happiness. No, no, no. Your absolute right to pursue happiness is always guaranteed because the judge can make a rationalization that is for a legitimate government purpose. Go fuck yourself, Mr. Individual Citizen of the Republic. The Republic is dead. Your rights are void for vagueness. You've made your legal structure into a kind of political rhetoric, into a kind of promise, into a nice looking promise. And what does it mean? It means nothing. You have to protect your rights at the ballot box. It's not a republic. It's not, quite frankly, the whole thing is designed to tend towards a kind of French cock-up, or in terms of the Napoleonic corruption. I call it that, but you might make argument that it's the American corruption, since the American Revolution happened before Napoleon. But I would even say that Napoleon, moving in the footsteps of America, in some sense showed more authentically the shadow of what America had done, but America took longer for it to unwind, for the de facto constitutional crisis to actually meet its end, or meet its inevitable sort of failure point, which I archetypally describe as that when a social justice warrior goes to court, and when they lose in court, they don't hear the judge saying, "You, Mr. Social Justice Warrior, are unreasonable, you are immoral, and I rule against you." That's not what the judge says. The judge says, "Come back to me when you have more political power and I'll rule in your favor. All you have to do is change the legislation." That is not a respectable situation. That means that people, in some sense, will have only their rights as long as they can protect them through the ballot box. And in some sense, you can say, well, that's what it's designed to do. It's designed to keep the culture politically on call, or rather to keep the culture politically vigilant. And in some sense, therefore, it is some mode of modulation or evolution of some variant of the British common law. But I would just point out that when the British have their common law structure, they didn't poison the legal well itself. They didn't create an explicit constitution which itself hard-boiled they allowed the law to actually be cultivated organically, whereas in America it's cultivated through political leadership, in some sense, or through political representation. And so, in some sense, you are held back by the rule of man. You are held back by the majority, or something like that. And look, that is an authentic style of democracy in some sense, but it's a democracy in which the republic aspect of it is fundamentally taking the back seat. Anyway, it's suboptimal. And I would say my country had the optimal arrangement. And you could even perhaps sociologically make an argument, and in some sense, de facto, it's perhaps even a valid argument, but I would reject this argument on the basis of normative values and ethics, is that, well, South Africa did not respect the culture enough. The judiciary has too much power over politics, and in some sense, because politics has become so institutionally corrupt, and now that essentially political appointments of judges and also the ideology of social justice, reinterpreting the Constitution, has effectively created an institutionalized corruption of the law itself, that the Constitution has literally been betrayed and overridden and reinterpreted with a racialist creed and a disgusting proto-fascist, sort of culture which has taken over, in the same way that the social justice, message is broadcast in America. So because of all these things happening, arguably both South Africa and America would both be overrun by this failure mode, essentially. But in some sense, it is the fact that people, at least in the South African case, I could say, well, it's because people won't defend the Constitution. It's because people don't value the Constitution, or they don't care to understand it, or they care to have their identity consciousness prior. They care to have their identity politics first, and it doesn't matter. They don't care about fairness and integrity and justice. They would rather have their social justice, and their reinterpretation of the phrase social justice. Okay, so anyway, my point is that what things are in the structure of the law in South Africa is actually the guiding light. But and in some sense, I'm sensitive to the counter argument. Well, they have changed what things mean, and culture can do that. Culture can involute itself. It can make itself go so insane, so pathetic, so crazy, so misled by journalistic, sort of propaganda artists and things like that, and people normalizing proto-fascist politics, which I would argue has come mainly from America. But anyway, what is my point? My point is that what is my point? At least as a blueprint, South Africa, I do think is the space aged, is the future, or something like that. I mean, it's too bad that historically South Africa developed all the right solutions, but was not, let's say, historically in a sound enough position to conserve and preserve the hard fought democratic revolution that had a republic which was, let's say, the most advanced that this planet has ever had. The Earth has never had a better structure of government and politics and law than South Africa. I know that those sound like bold claims to make, and especially in the state of its institutionalized corruption, but that is as the case may be. And in some sense, I would say that a lot of that could be argued as extenuating circumstances. But those examples, I hope, will preserve in history and still be taken as an example and still be used as the gold standard, as the model, because they would solve all the problems. I mean, you could cut and paste almost verbatim the Bill of Rights in the South African Constitution and put them in the American Constitution, but you would also have to change some of the nature of the judiciary itself in America, essentially giving it, also importing the Roman Dutch substantive law, so that essentially the judiciary would have full functional independence from politics, that politics could still invent policy, could still invent programs, but they would be seen within a broad framework of principle, anyway, that would be equally accessible to both the state and the citizen. Anyway, okay, I went down that. Okay, anyway, but then at least we have a common edifice of what things mean, and or maybe not explicitly a common edifice, but implicitly we have a common edifice, because if there is a controversy, if there is some kind of conflict, there is a remedy. There's this beautiful principle in the Roman Dutch law, which is that there is no right without a remedy. If there is no remedy, the right does not exist. So to speak about having a right where there is no remedy attached to it in law is useless. It is not a right. Okay, so if we want to have rights and we want to use those rights as a set of shared values in which we can use it as the premise and the predicate of having a common society, a common decent society, of what things mean. Anyway, now this is the problem, is that essentially people that are anxious and bashful, they go over this kind of stuff, because music is both secular and sacred, because they can get involuted in their own tune, in their own chorus, in their own private sort of sense, which sort of rides roughshod over all these delicate matters that I just try to model to you in some sense. And this is somewhat exemplified in Pharaoh, because Pharaoh will say, yes, you can go, and then he changes his mind later. And the reason why he can change his mind is because his culture, because he's the Pharaoh, he's the king, and you know, he's making concessions, and the only way that he can bind himself to his own concession in word, when he speaks that yes, you can go, and then he changes his mind later, is because in Pharaoh's culture, the only way that he is bidden in his own word is when it is written and not when it is spoken. It must be written. And because Moses does not compel him to have it written, his bashfulness and his anxiousness, it's is essentially and that is the space in which God wanted to produce the kingdom. This is why how the Jews left in the story is the most important crux. It's not that they left, it's how they left. They left, they didn't just take themselves and leave. They took the integrity of the Egyptian system in the mind of the Pharaoh itself. They invalidated. They stole the fire of the integrity of the Egyptian civilization, and in some sense, I would link. I know this is I'm not explaining this very well, but let me just say that essentially the place to grow the kingdom of God is in the displacement of the bashfulness and the anxiousness, which is plugged in to this, well, how is it written? Has it been written? Because, and as I say, if you already have the kingdom established, then there are at least illustrations, there are ports of call. But in some sense, even if you have the perfect harmony, even if you have the outward observational markers and tokens of a well-functioning society, of a high-trust society, high trust does not mean high integrity. People that want a high-trust society, but they are not willing to go through the discovery and to hold the treasure of what integrity means, have lost the plot, and in some sense they are just in some random good luck or something like that. They are just following the tradition. They're following, but who knows this is what I was trying to say about what Evan McMullen was saying about the Linux people versus the Windows people, is that in some sense, well, if you want to say that these are two modes of interacting, one of those modes, the one in which you actually have to understand how it works one of those modes of understanding and knowledge is actually necessary. One of them is superfluous, and one of them is necessary. You do need people in a society who do understand things from a hardware technical perspective. And in some sense, those people who are in the hardware technical perspective, let's say the people who use Linux secretly while everyone else uses Windows, and maybe they keep the fact that Linux even exists, this is a thought experiment, is in some sense a secret, because no one else needs to know, and you don't want other people to be jealous that there's a deeper level of understanding when they'll go and try to invent their own Linux and it'll have lots of bugs in it or something like that, and then they'll try to spread their distribution of Linux, and it will cause a whole sort of crops of failures and things like that. Is that you understand that the reason why this is a recurring motif, this is a recurring sort of tug of war, is because the one is superfluous and the more honest one, the more. So the question is not about how to integrate integrity into Windows. That's not what the question is. The question is how to transparently provide access and ports of call into invigilating, because in some sense, this is the problem with the Occupy Wall Street, is that these are people who have no idea how to reform the system, demanding reform of the system. I mean, it's profane indulgence. These are miscreants who are, the best ones in Occupy Wall Street were the ones who were saying, we know that this is a profane vanity, that this is a waste of time, that we are here looking for the other people in the crowd who agree that this is a profane vanity, that this is a waste of time, so we can actually have a powwow, so we can actually talk about it with other people that are actually serious about this. because this kind of, is as a point of meeting, not as a point of signaling to you know of signaling to the rest of society, because it's a childish. It's sort of like when a child is wailing because somebody else must come and clean it up from its own, soiling itself. That is what Occupy Wall Street is. It's completely unserious. Uh, anyway, and it also doesn't deserve to be taken seriously. Is what is worse. If it is taken seriously, you are in some sense, it's an you can use it as an indirect ingredient of something. Like I'm using it right now as an indirect ingredient of something. I'm commenting on it, so I'm reprocessing it, but within an independent substantiation in which, so it can be useful in that indirect sense only, I would argue. But anyway, and well, obviously I'm just talking, and but in some sense, this is quite strange because this doesn't model itself obviously into scaling it up into practical things. But the point is that because it is necessary that you understand things from the hard way up, at some point you have to either cultivate or pay for people to actually have integrity, and to make their integrity in their deep understanding into making bridges, or to making portals or transparent windows. Wow, that's actually a perfect metaphor here. That you use when you use windows, that there is a window into that there are portals of transparent windows that you can then see what's going on underneath it, or something like that. I mean, as per your uh, anyway, I mean, I should have probably take more heed of what Evan's actual point was here between the problems on either side. But I would just say that one of the problems are more pressing, which is in some sense the I mean, I've made this argument before, that there's often a necessary problem and a sufficient problem, and it's better just to actually create a framework around a sufficient problem, so that there is at least some integrated web of possible uh, reconfiguration, that individuals can have some participatory influence therein. Um, but I mean, in some sense, it's a good scale of it's a good example to work in, because because practically I mean, you see manifestly, all the problems is that, well, even if you have a well working system, and then you work out all these revisions of how it would be better, but it's just simply impossible to like jump that gap, because everything is already functioning in real time, and you would have to like have a reset in order to shift from the one to the other, and you would need like, you know everyone would have to sort of make that jump at the same time, kind of around the concept of 2000, like that all the computers would stop because of the date or something, or anyway, that breakdown is kind of like an example in reverse, because the idea was, well, we have this general cultural fear that everything is going to be broken, and therefore we need a patch, we need a fix to be distributed in order to prevent the failure. But in some sense, imagine that in reverse, that we would have to distribute all the patches so that everyone could enter a new integrated web that overcame some sort of lacuna, or some kind of suboptimal dysfunction. or relative dysfunction to the functionality which could be achieved on the basic hardware that already existed, that just needed some kind of coordinated and collaborative, sort of update. But how these things, how they are negotiated, how they are injected into the system, as it were, the lines of communication, and how people are invested in maintaining those lines of communication. I mean, in some sense, you could say that this is part of the deep substructure of what things mean at a sort of at a crystallized, broad web of life, and anyway, that perspective is not something that can be privately contended. It's something that has to be brokered. It's something that has to be embodied in some sense. And I mean, a lot of ways in which human beings have found a way to, in some sense, I think, deal with this aspect is that we develop roles and structures. We develop prerogative powers, and executive administration, and executive roles, and things like that. And uh, and in some sense, executive functions usually are only accountable to their own executive bodies, uh, which are administering and tracking and monitoring, um, and they don't have to be responsive to extraneous executive pressure, uh, uh, but perhaps if they actually perform administrative actions, then they have to give an account. There's actually a beautiful piece of legislation in South African law, which is secondary legislation, which reinforces a right in the Constitution, which is that you have the right to just administrative action. So if you are the recipient of some kind of administrative action against you, you can make an application to court, compelling the person who made the administrative action, or the body, or the entity, the organization, the corporation, to provide reasons for the administrative action, and then obviously that can be the extraction of those reasons, then and a full explanation of the decision making process, basically, and then you can use that as an ingredient to some kind of lawsuit if that is incorrect in fact, or incorrect in law, or something like that, or unreasonable, let's just say, or negligent, or anyway. So anyway, so there is that. Don't know if executive powers exactly fall under. I guess the rationale could be quite bashfully based on sort of a pure power claim, to have the power of being inclined to dispense a particular. Anyway, at least in the quality of the decision would be the character of the executive office bearer themselves would therefore be on display, at least, which in some circumstances might be a useful thing to extract. If executives are are in such a fora that they get substituted for or replaced or anyway. Anyway, the okay. So the point is what things mean, and people who have, in some sense, an internally compressed vision of what things mean because they have anxious and bashful emotional tones, they kind of fall into the de facto mean of society. They fall into the modus operandi of what the cultural average is. And if the cultural average, I would argue, isn't already sort of the kingdom of God, or at least has institutions of integrity that they can sort of model themselves after, or at least use as illustrative exemplars to be a style guide, or at least show them in principle or in a metaphor the error of their, I think that they are, and or again, like this might be baked in from having less play partners. If they didn't have the right, if they didn't have somebody else who was injecting a perspective, this particular one I think is a lack of sattva. I mean, again, okay, so like I'm trying to say, well, look, I'm a sattva personality. I have the sattvic personality, and I've created now this whole esoteric, let's say, gripe at action, at anxious and bashful emotional tones. And I'm saying that essentially, well, if these people at a very young age had sattvic personalities with where's that? Oh, here it is. With annoyed or no, sattvic personalities with angry and confused. Yeah. So in some sense, they have not been ameliorated by being patient and receptive, and actually grappling with play partners that model to them emotional tones of angry and confused, because merely being bashful and merely being anxious is not a especially is not a panacea to people who are confused. And in some sense, being anxious or being bashful will, as I say, it'll be at a higher level. So it'll just, they will regard it as that their emotional tone supersedes someone else who is confused, because they'll just be, oh well, you're just confused. Never mind taking on board that confusion, empathizing with that confusion, and having to play it out, and then realizing that their anxiousness or bashfulness is essentially an egregious projection, if I can, in some sense, calling it a projection is definitely true, because both anxiousness and bashfulness are connected with the first dimension, the most crude dimension of psychological reality, of instinct, of what will be. So they are already baked into a certain prediction. They're already baked into a certain anyway. And they are doing that within the medium also of what things mean. So they are speaking canonically, unilaterally. They are dictating what things mean, even so that they can reframe their own spoken word after the fact. I mean, these are people, I would also argue, this kind of emotional tone combined with compression, I would say, would also have a lot of potential confabulation built into it. But that's obvious. That's perhaps only when it is present with other structures within the false ego complex, other structures like uh, like of the narcissistic sort of variety. Um, I'm not saying everyone with this tone will, but I mean, obviously, when you have confabulation in the structure of a certain personality complex combined with anxiousness, anxious and bashful emotional tones, you've got a source of melodrama that is a never-ending Anyway, okay. There was another thing that I wanted to bring up, which this is somewhat of a disparate point, but it's an interesting little aside, um, and I've thought about this for a while, and I don't know if it's how well it slots in here, but idolatry and indolence can be a pretty good summary of a canonical category of everything that's wrong with people uh, within emotional tone circuitry. Um, and it's interesting because I would make also direct reference to this in Revelations when it talks about all the different inequities, and it talks about essentially all these sorts of people doing filthy things about filthy things, and then it gives one other category of people that are doing bad things, which is that, and people who loveth and maketh a lie, which is quite interesting. What I would argue is happening in the trans movement, which is essentially predicated on lying to children about basic facts, involuting them into a kind of surrealist, decompartmentalized reality, because reality can just be a facet of a kind of political projection. And if you can justify lying to children, then you can obviously justify, being self-righteous and holding the high ground and being able to get your way just by sort of creating new language and semantics and forcing everybody else to have to adopt it. If you really have that kind of unilateral power, which I will argue is, again, kind of also centered around being anxious and being bashful, um, because for you it contains a model of how the kingdom is arrived at, the or something like that, but it's in your private conjecture. It's not really shared. It's something that must be observed in order to be shared, and therefore other people must conform with your unilateral dictate of decorum and etiquette. It's about subservience and compliance. It's not about a shared understanding or a shared spirit, um, or anything like that, or having a shared understanding or a common understanding or a meeting of the minds. Anyway, so it's interesting that the second thing that I say, indolence. Now, what I link conceptually with indolence is, I would argue, even what I've just said, creating dichotomies, like saying, well, there's idolatry and there's indolence. That itself can be a form of indolence. Not necessarily, but it can be. All knowledge claims, all understanding claims, can merely be reduced in somebody else's relative perspective as being just a form of activated indolence, can be a form of essentially escapism or something like that. Oh, well, you're trying not to function. You're trying not to live up to, let's just say, you're not seeking the kingdom. I mean, I think is the archetypal thing, is that in some sense, indolence is not seeking the kingdom. And if you have a perspective, if you have a point of view that you're resting on, oh, well, there's just idolatry and indolence, anything can be used as an idolatry. And in some sense, both idolatry and indolence are both, in some sense, just the positive and negative of idolatry, in that the negative being omission and the positive being commission, that you will either commission yourself towards idolatry, or you will omit acting. The omission is perhaps, maybe it's too tricky to even call it omission, idolatry by omission, in that you have failed to enact a purpose. You have failed to try and seek an eternal purpose. You have stopped trying to cultivate an eternal life. You are instead now falling under the auspices of essentially a degraded purpose, a relegated purpose, a purpose that is merely trying to guarantee and secure its own existence. It's merely trying to survive. It is a frugal strategy of desperation, and this, I would say, is all under the character of those who loveth and maketh a lie, who I would argue again are in indolence, and they're in indolence of the richness of their own understanding, of their own knowledge. They are not meek in that sense. They are too rich in their own investment, and in that structure, in that commitment, they are giving to themselves the gift of indolence. And although it might not be a commission, I would say by omission they are in a state of idolatry, but it's quite implicit, it's quite tacit. So it's hard to actually to underline it, because they would say that they're not, that they're just kind of, they're treading water. They're just kind of, but what they have done is they have actively found a way to displace seeking the kingdom, which I would argue is seeking what things mean. Which I would argue as well is what these anxious and bashful types have a tremendous, I mean, in the same way that Saul was a tremendously, like, I don't want to give King David a free pass or something like that, because in some sense, perhaps what Saul was doing to David was also not just about Saul, it was also about David, in that the bashfulness and the anxiousness of Saul was, I mean, perhaps also that was to do with Samuel's choice of Saul, that Samuel chose Saul not to be a good king, but to be a good teacher of David, but to give David essentially an internal godly instruction of the of what false prophecy is in the realm of politics, and in the thread of the executive. And it is obviously, I mean, I'm calling on also the general theme within Scripture, which is that the Messiah will be in the line of David. Anyway, that is how the Messiah is also spoken of, or at least in the Christian. But anyway, the kind of turmoil which Saul did to David is perhaps an instruction, or a lesson which even David did not, I would even argue, live up to, but at least he did so fully consciously. In some sense, the sin that Saul was enacting was a consequence of his station, was a consequence of his executive power, and in some sense there was not a commission of idolatry so much as an indolence, but also an incapability to overcome, because he has no model to allow him to reconcile his own internal sort of circuitry, if I can put it like that. Whereas David has been at the brunt of this kind of abuse, and has been on the receiving end from this kind of iniquity. And so when David does things incorrectly, there is his indolence is nescience. His indolence is nescient, and so if he is nescient in his iniquity, then at least the judgment is is quite honest, in some sense, in his soul, in the story as recorded in Scripture. You cannot give David a free pass for the horrible things that he does, uh, essentially arranging for a man to be killed so that he can marry his wife. Um, Putting a man on the front lines or something like that, uh, arranging for a man to be put on the front lines in battles. Um, and anyway, centering back on the subject of indolence is that, this is a very schismatic conundrum of what is indolence. What does indolence mean in this context of me creating this category? Because in some sense, canonically trying to fit things into this category system is itself very much prone to being a mode of indolence itself, a substitution of being actually participatory and engaged. That you can rest on this sort of dead structure and extract a kind of dead script, and force people to play in a dead player sort of game in this or something like that. And in some sense, these are just themes, in some sense, which, the question is often, well, where does the weight of meaning actually lie in conformance with essentially, and in some sense, the classical liberal way of actually, which I would even argue was developed out of kind of Christian line of thinking, uh, is that essentially, it's by consent, it's by what is asked. Essentially, you don't answer what is not asked. You don't provide what is not. Uh, you don't try to gift something, that is not going to be received as a gift, in some sense, that is going to be received as an imposition, that you don't essentially detract, you know, that you don't provide unsolicited, sort of, those are actually too sloppy and vague way to talk about that, but essentially, um, without the only way to prevent cultivating indolence within people is that you essentially stop providing to them things which they haven't explicitly set the intention or the motivation of aligning themselves with. That you don't essentially, the silver spoon is what is essentially, is the kind of malfeasance and miscreant nature of the Occupy Wall Street that I have been railing against, is that the idea that people that have no idea how anything functions just want things to be better to serve their interest better, and they are not interested in fixing it thusly. They are just expecting it somehow. That there is something deeply wrong with this. There is something, uh, at the kernel of that, which is the start of each cycle of tyrannical regime and pathetic, sort of substandard devolution, and into mob justice and into other forms of disgusting, uh, uh, regression and debauchery, and or some kind of half-baked state of Napoleonic corruption which is not capable of conserving its own edifice. When you move away from the classical liberal model, you really endanger and threaten in some sense. And the only way that we can actually have, let's say, a higher rate, a higher level edifice, is if at least we are doing so on a platform of glass in which we can look through the floor and see all the columns holding us up in some sense. And if no one is willing to look down and peer through the floor, um, then there is no integrity that is going to keep the system afloat, because it will be essentially floating up in the adrift, where whatever wind of anxiousness and bashfulness and relativity, relativism is going to blow it around. Um, so, and some people will say, oh, we've just invented a new style of jazz, and now we are the conduit through which the culture is expressing its tune and its chorus, and we're moving along. And it's some kind of participatory, half-baked process, but it's not understandable. It's subjectively passable, Parsable, passable, but it's not. That's you probably have to spell out pass-able, but anyway, it's just that is a mythology. Quite frankly, that is a mythology which I will even say is on par with proto-fascist type ethos. With where how will you actually solve the intricate problem? How will you actually deal with real controversy? How will you actually get down to the heart of a matter when there are disagreements? And just say, well, one person says, well, I have an understanding about these things. Another person says, well, I have an opinion about them. Well, I'm sorry, but your opinion is not relevant when you're dealing with someone that has an understanding. Unless you want to have an impasse, unless you want to say, well, there's no point in having a meeting of the mind because by the opinion holder's side, they unilaterally say, well, we have a difference of opinion. And the other person says, well, no, we have a failure to have a common understanding or a shared understanding, or my understanding is that we have a difference of opinion. So the one understanding is fundamentally schismatic and insoluble or irreconcilable. And the only thing that can sort of, so having an understanding-based society in which we understand our limits, we understand our humility, we understand many, many different things, and we understand the fields of freedom and things like that, and there are ports of call and there are ways of settling things that at least can in principle be settled, and other things that perhaps can't be settled because they're up for the personal domain of freedom and liberty, and we're trying to preserve that as well. The idea that we can just sort of mix everything into the commons, I would, and all this, sort of all these horrible ideas about self-organizing bullshit. All that stuff, I would argue, is a manifestation. It's not as if it's not like a real phenomena, but it's not a healthy phenomena. I'll just put it like that. It's sort of, you could call it cosmic luck or something like that, or you can call it, but it's not fundamentally something that is going to be transmutated into an understanding. If that happens within a structure that already has integrity and fidelity, so be it. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. But if that becomes its own cult and religion, it can't even conserve itself. So please don't waste everyone's time with that bullshit. But let me just also say that that is the same as targeting a high trust society, but not targeting high integrity. You're going to fuck yourselves over. You're going to breed yourselves out of your own system. It's going to devolve and collapse as well. But the point that I'm trying to navigate towards is that the idea that you're going to sort of ennoble the common pleb, or you're going to ennoble the common standard of society or something like that, and that standard is not going to be raised or something like that, or that there are, that somehow, because of the developmental dysfunction of our times and because of the lack of people's development on their individual characters, and also because of essentially having very dysfunctional, psychological pedagogy and things like that, that we're going to also write off whole subcultures. We're going to say, well, the black family in America is dysfunctional, not because of essentially having a toxic subculture, but because it has something to do with their ethnicity, which is utterly racist and stupid. The reason why the common black experience in America is fucked up is because of the toxic culture in it. It has nothing to do with the DNA of those people. it has to do with the entrenchment of essentially anti-family values. The black family in America was more intact and had higher rates of literacy than the average white family in America. They were on average slightly poorer, and therefore when the welfare state kicked in, it basically blew that apart. And so if we're going to say that the black subculture, I mean, Harlem, you know, class mobility in the black family in America was was better than other um, racial designations and things like that. So I mean, if it had just kept on those trends, it would have been fine. The reason why those trends did not keep on was essentially because of democratic policy, of the Democratic Party, of the welfare state, essentially. It hobbled and destroyed. You know, I mean, some sense even the proto racist, you know, sort of Black Panther sort of people were always wary of the white liberal, as they called it, not the classical liberals, not the but the democratic form of liberal in inverted commas, um, and rightly so, because in some sense it's the conservatives who look at people queerly, and they look at people and they say, "Are you really one of us? What are your values?" And they judge your character. That is much more edifying to have a common, decent society that is shared and has shared standards than the democratic so called liberal who says, "Oh, yes, we have done you wrong, and you as an identity need help," and the infantilism and the bullshit. Um, and that has been baked into a culture. You know, the democratic plantation that Candace Owens talks about is a perfect metaphor. Um, anyway, and that has now been baked into identity politics, and it has been baked into even how these liberals talk about people, as if it that is what people are like, rather than it's not just a very sick fucking culture that is toxic as fuck. They have their own words which you're not allowed to use. They can use words, and other people can't use those words. What is that? What is that? These people are essentially the other side of the coin. I mean, it's interesting because they have literally filled up the void of, you know, somehow the, the party of the Ku Klux Klan, which has always been the Democrats, have found a way essentially to get their plan of subversion and to get people. They found a way to inculcate it into the black culture that they suppress themselves. Essentially, it's disgusting. Um, and it's all done by sympathy. It's all done by this anxious, bashful relativism, and it's and their own sort of. Anyways, again, I'm linking it with this stuff. I mean, I've called it in other recordings and from long ago. I've called it sort of the intuitive feeling quadra. Anyway, sort of link it to that. Anyway, sorry, I'm going off my subject matter. So to talk about the indolence, that the indolence, in some sense, the indolence cannot be overcome as an individual. The indolence can only be overcome as a technology, as a shared style of modus operandi of negotiation, persuasion, being convincing. I try to make these papers available to people. I haven't put them. I don't think I've put them in the blurb at the bottom of my videos, but there's a paper, Epistemic Agency by Catherine Algan, and also a chapter in a book called Living with Nihilism by Vasti Root. Very excellent papers that are worth reading, on this kind of normative morality and things like that. And yeah, and people that just want to. Anyway, so developing a structure of culture and that in some sense knows how to navigate this kind of these indolence mechanics in some sense. Um, I mean, I would say the only thing that's problematic about rule omega and perhaps the innovation between rule omega and code omega um, is a kind of teleological debugging troubleshoot. Because, if you want to try to language something, you want to try to discuss something, you want to try to air something, but it's not coming out nicely, the only way to, I would say, fix that is to go back to, what is the project, what is the purpose, what is the heading of this, of what we're trying to fumble into or experiment into. And it's fine to experiment and to not know what you're doing, but essentially just have some, even if it's a vague heading or something like that, because I guess sometimes you don't have a purpose connected with a thought, but you think that it holds some water, or that it was a precursor or a kind of catalyst towards seeing a paradigm in which things might become soluble. There are impossible steps that can be taken towards new vistas, like in the same way that complex numbers are used in mathematics. Anyway, so all those sorts of things. And I would even argue that there might even be a lot of that within the cognitive function circuits, uh, which I haven't even mentioned while talking about this, the imaginary circuits, because there are, and I don't even know what to say about them. I've speculated that there might be angels, that essentially, that if you have enough psychic energy in the mix, that even inertly or outside of human being, that there might be there might be field converters. I would call individual false ego complexes field converters, because they can convert psychic energy from one field into another field. They can transmutate it internally. And there are also emotional tone circuitry, which I threw out as non sequitur, because I said no, a human being could not think this. You cannot have a chain of thinking with these cognitive functions. And because in my system there are 48 cognitive functions, but there are another 24 which I threw out as being non sequitur. I said, or I just rejected them. I said no, there's no way that someone could actually have this thought process. Um, and I and but in some sense they could be imagined to occur, or they could also be shared converters in the imaginary space. They could sort of exist between people, not ever seen, but they could essentially still convert psychic energy. So, in some sense, that might also have to do. Anyway, that to me gives a connotation of hidden manna or something like that. That being, and that might also have to do with what Solomon was doing with the key of Solomon and things like that. Might have been connected with those sorts of things. But I uh, and in some sense they might be both angels and demons operating in it's just the sort of the style of how those things, as in a serial computational process, is working. But the idea that those work in the background, that they work beyond people, that in some sense they could be like the quantum boiling pot, that it doesn't boil when you're watching, it only boils when you're not watching. And so it's sort of like that is the also perhaps the field of divine intervention, um, which I should just point out that my view of God is not that he lives outside, is that he lives deeply at the core of the spiritual consciousness. It's not a sky father. Um, it's the sustainer and maintainer of consciousness. It doesn't begin creation. It sustains creation as it sustains consciousness. But that's also because I have some very weird views on the notion of time itself. That time is not. Uh, time is not. Yeah. So I'm a complete anti-realist. I don't believe that time is real. I believe that time is a um, an attribute of consciousness, basically. So I ground everything in phenomenology, in consciousness. But anyway, okay, I've probably said enough. But and this is also why, I also think that the word conciliation is a useful, rigorous process, but at the end of the day, you're going to mislead yourself. You're going to mislead everyone if you essentially don't, at the end of the day, say, well, there's no such thing as conciliation. There's reconciliation with the ideal form of conciliation, which, in some sense, can only be cashed out is we love it because it first loved us, and it is God, and the good, the one, the Trinity, and there has to be some kind of model of how it's integrated, which, I have in my 17 model, but anyway, which is basically a phenomenological metaphysic. Okay, well, which is useful because it can be used probably to understand all of psychology, which is at least what I'm working on integrating. But okay, so I've covered everything that I'm going to cover, I guess. Perhaps I focus too much on this one issue of anxiousness and bashfulness, because there are also other cognitive functions which go above dimension 13, above dimension 11, um, which is the cut-off mark, I believe, because, I modeled this off of in scripture when it says that a third of the angels fell from heaven. Uh, this is complicated, but essentially what that means is that we were, ironically, it means we were cut off from 2/3 of heaven. Um, so there's a kind of, anyway, uh, in the state of the fall, in the state of, which is basically happening on the level of the 11th dimension, extroverted intuition, that is the crux of the problem that needs to basically be fixed, which can only be fixed by the individual sort of self-actualization and re-establishment of the superego, of the parent, of essentially stabilizing the parent function in the superego, which is the root of all the problems, which is essentially that the tree of life itself was not properly established, that the tree of life needs to be encapsulated by the New Jerusalem, essentially. But you weren't born with the New Jerusalem, you were only born into the Garden of Eden, essentially, is the archetypal low resolution problem to be solved. Um, anyway, let me stop this recording. Jumping around too much anyway.